The relic of the true cross was raised before the assembled knights, catching the weak winter sunlight as the wind off the Mediterranean stirred the banners around it. Baldwin IV dismounted with visible effort, his attendants supporting his weight as his legs trembled beneath him. Chroniclers later wrote that he knelt in the dust, unable to feel the ground beneath his knees, and prayed aloud for strength not for himself, but for the kingdom he believed God had placed in his care. The sight of their young, diseased king humbling himself before battle struck deeply into the men watching. Many of them had fought before. Few had ever felt this mixture of fear, reverence, and defiance. When Baldwin rose, he did not give a long speech. There was no need. Every man present understood the stakes. Retreat meant slow death and eventual conquest. Victory, however unlikely, meant survival. The knights mounted in silence, lowering their lances. The order was simple and terrifying, a full charge, straight into the heart of Saladin's army. Saladin, at that moment, was unprepared. His forces were strung out across the plain, many units scattered in search of supplies or plunder. His cavalry, the backbone of his strength, was not fully assembled. He expected skirmishes at most, perhaps a defensive posture by the Franks. A concentrated assault by the full mounted strength of Jerusalem did not factor into his calculations. The attack came like a thunderclap. Baldwin's knights burst from concealment and surged forward at full gallop. The ground shook beneath hundreds of hooves striking in unison. The narrow front compressed their force, turning limited numbers into concentrated violence. The lances shattered on impact. Horses slammed into infantry formations that had no time to form proper ranks. Muslim chroniclers later described the moment as sudden chaos. Men trampled before they could draw their swords, commanders shouting orders drowned out by screams and dust. At the center of the charge rode Baldwin himself, supported by his household knights, his presence visible enough to be recognized. The sight of a king leading from the front carried enormous symbolic weight in medieval warfare. It told the men behind him that retreat was impossible, and it told the enemy that this was not a feint or a raid, but a fight to the death. Saladin attempted to rally his forces, but the shock was too severe. Units that should have supported one another were isolated. Some fled immediately, believing they were being attacked by a much larger force than actually existed. Others attempted to regroup, only to be smashed by successive waves of Frankish cavalry exploiting the disorder. The terrain worked against Saladin. His army, optimized for maneuver warfare and archery, required space and coordination. The sudden close quarters fighting negated these advantages. Archers could not loose effectively into the chaos without risking their own men. Cavalry found themselves blocked by panicked infantry. Commanders lost control. The Knights Templar, trained to maintain formation even under extreme pressure, drove deeper and deeper into the enemy mass. Their discipline prevented the charge from dissolving into scattered individual combat, a common danger for medieval cavalry. Instead, they reformed and struck again, each pass widening the collapse. Saladin himself was nearly captured. Accounts describe his personal guard fighting desperately to clear a path as the Frankish charge came perilously close. His banner was threatened. His camp was overrun. Supplies, tents, and treasures were abandoned as his army disintegrated around him. By midday, what had begun as a confident invasion had turned into a rout. Thousands of Saladin's men lay dead or wounded. Many more fled in disorder toward Egypt, pursued relentlessly by Frankish cavalry who understood that this moment would not come again. Heat, thirst, and exhaustion finished what swords had begun. The once massive army ceased to function as a coherent force. Baldwin's knights did not stop until their horses could go no further. Only then did the scale of the victory become clear. Against every expectation, a force of fewer than 500 mounted knights had shattered one of the largest armies the region had seen in decades. The casualty figures stunned contemporaries on both sides. Saladin lost thousands, Baldwin lost comparatively few. As evening fell, Baldwin was once again assisted from his horse. His body was failing, but his kingdom stood intact. The victory at Montgisard echoed across the Near East and Europe alike. For the Crusader states, it was proof that survival was still possible. For Saladin, it was a humbling lesson in the dangers of overconfidence. The consequences of that single day rippled outward. Saladin did not abandon his goal of conquering Jerusalem, but he would never again underestimate Baldwin Roman IV. The balance of power temporarily stabilized. Diplomacy shifted. Allies reconsidered their positions. For a brief moment, the kingdom of Jerusalem breathed freely. Montgisard did not end the struggle between Crusader and Muslim. It did not erase the overwhelming demographic and strategic disadvantages faced by the Franks, but it delayed the inevitable, buying precious years of survival. More importantly, it entered history as one of the most improbable battlefield victories ever recorded. A moment when leadership, timing, and morale overcame numbers on a staggering scale. In the years that followed, Baldwin's health would continue to decline. His body would fail long before his will. Yet on that November day in 1177, the leper king rode into legend, not as a symbol of weakness, but as a reminder that history is sometimes decided not by armies at their strongest, but by those who refuse to accept defeat. In the days after the battle, the scale of Saladin's defeat slowly became clear. Survivors straggled back toward Egypt in small, broken groups, many without weapons, mounts, or supplies. What had begun as a confident invasion ended as a desperate retreat across hostile territory. Muslim chroniclers, usually careful to preserve Saladin's reputation, did not hide the shock. Some described the defeat as a divine test. Others admitted bluntly that arrogance and poor discipline had undone an otherwise superior force. Saladin himself barely escaped, abandoning much of his baggage and treasury in his flight. For Baldwin Roman IV and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the immediate aftermath was a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and disbelief. The Frankish army was too small and too battered to pursue a long campaign, but it did not need to. The threat had been lifted. Cities that had prepared for siege reopened their gates. Villages that had fled or been burned began the slow work of recovery. News of the victory spread rapidly along trade routes and pilgrim roads, carried by merchants, clerics, and envoys who understood how rare such a triumph was. Politically, the victory transformed Baldwin's standing overnight. Before Montgisard, many barons viewed him as a tragic figurehead, a dying boy whose illness made long-term planning impossible. After Montgisard, he was recognized as a legitimate war leader. His authority strengthened, not because he ruled by fear, but because he had proven willing to risk everything alongside his men. In a feudal society built on personal loyalty, this mattered enormously. The military orders benefited as well. The Knights Templar, in particular, emerged with enhanced prestige. Their discipline under pressure became legendary, and recruitment from Europe increased in the years following the battle. Donations flowed in from noble families inspired by the story of impossible victory against overwhelming odds. Montgisard became a recruitment tool, a living argument that the Holy Land could still be defended. Saladin, meanwhile, was forced into recalibration. Contrary to later myths that portray him as unbroken and unstoppable, this defeat left a deep impression on him. He temporarily shifted strategy away from direct confrontation with Jerusalem. Raids continued, but major invasions were delayed. He focused instead on consolidating control elsewhere, repairing morale, and studying his enemy more carefully. From this point forward, he would never again allow his forces to disperse so recklessly in enemy territory. The battle also altered diplomatic dynamics. Neighboring Muslim rulers, some of whom had grudgingly accepted Saladin's leadership, took note of his vulnerability. Unity remained, but it was no longer unquestioned. On the Christian side, European courts viewed the Kingdom of Jerusalem with renewed interest. Reinforcements and funds increased, though never enough to guarantee long-term survival. Despite the victory, Baldwin understood its limits. His kingdom remained outnumbered and surrounded. Montgisard had bought time, not security. He used that time aggressively. Fortifications were strengthened. Alliances were reinforced. Military readiness became constant rather than reactive. Baldwin personally involved himself in strategic planning, compensating for his physical decline with relentless attention to detail. His disease continued its slow, merciless advance. Sensation in his limbs faded further. His eyesight deteriorated. Pain came and went unpredictably, yet he refused to withdraw from public life. Contemporary accounts emphasize how deliberately he maintained appearances, attending councils, reviewing troops, and presiding over courts even as his condition worsened. To step aside, he believed, would signal weakness to enemies waiting for any excuse to strike. Montgisard became a psychological shield as much as a military one. As long as Baldwin lived, Saladin hesitated. Every potential invasion carried the memory of that catastrophic day when superior numbers had meant nothing. Even rumors of Baldwin's presence were sometimes enough to deter raids, a testament to how deeply the battle had lodged itself in the collective memory of the region. Over time, however, reality reasserted itself. Baldwin's health declined beyond concealment. Succession questions resurfaced, reopening factional rivalries within the kingdom. Without the unifying force of his leadership, internal divisions grew sharper. Saladin, patient and observant, waited. Yet even as the strategic balance gradually shifted back in Saladin's favor, Montgisard retained its power as a symbol. It challenged assumptions about medieval warfare. It demonstrated that morale, leadership, and timing could overturn numerical advantage. It showed that surprise, when combined with disciplined shock forces, could shatter even the most confident army. Modern historians often caution against exaggeration. The numbers involved, while dramatic, are drawn from medieval sources prone to inflation. Saladin's army may not have been exactly 26,000, nor Baldwin's exactly 500. But even conservative estimates confirm the same truth. Baldwin's force was vastly outnumbered, and the victory was real, decisive, and shocking. What makes Montgisard endure in historical memory is not simply the defeat of Saladin, but the image of Baldwin himself. A teenage king, dying of a disease that robbed him of strength and sensation, choosing confrontation over caution, leading from the front when retreat would have been safer, refusing to surrender agency to illness or fate. In the years that followed, Baldwin IV would fight again, negotiate, rule, and slowly fade. He would never see old age. His kingdom would eventually fall, Jerusalem captured by Saladin in 1187, a decade after Montgisard. But that later defeat does not diminish the earlier victory. Instead, it sharpens it, highlighting how extraordinary that single day truly was. History often remembers empires and conquerors. Montgisard reminds us that moments of defiance can matter just as much. For one day in 1177, a dying king and a handful of knights reshaped the political and psychological landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. They proved that inevitability is often an illusion, and that even the most powerful forces can be broken when confidence turns into complacency. As the memory of Montgisard settled into legend, its deeper meaning began to unfold not only in chronicles, but in how both sides adapted their entire approach to war. The battle forced a reassessment of power that went far beyond one day of fighting. For the Crusader states, it reinforced a belief that survival depended on speed, unity, and decisive leadership, rather than static defense. For Saladin, it marked the end of improvisation and the beginning of a far more calculated campaign that would eventually reshape the Near East. In the months following the battle, Baldwin IV worked relentlessly to turn victory into stability. He understood that morale fades quickly if not reinforced by visible strength. Garrisons were reinforced. Roads and supply points were secured. Coastal defenses were tightened to prevent another sudden incursion from Egypt. Baldwin's council meetings grew longer, his involvement more intense, even as his physical condition worsened. He compensated for failing strength with preparation, insisting on readiness even during periods of relative calm. The psychological impact of Montgisard proved almost as powerful as the physical one. Muslim commanders now treated even small Frankish forces with caution, uncertain whether another sudden, concentrated strike might be imminent. Rumors exaggerated Baldwin's strength, portraying him as a king sustained by divine favor rather than mortal flesh. This mythologizing, though unintended, bought the Crusader states time, which Baldwin used carefully. Saladin, for his part, absorbed the lesson with discipline. He tightened command structures, limited dispersal, and placed greater emphasis on reconnaissance. His future campaigns would be marked by patience rather than haste. Where Montgisard had been a campaign of confidence, later operations would be campaigns of inevitability, designed to exhaust rather than shock. Saladin shifted focus toward isolating the Crusader states economically and diplomatically, weakening them before committing to decisive confrontation. This contrast between leadership styles became increasingly stark. Baldwin ruled a small, fragile kingdom that required constant attention. Saladin commanded a vast, resource-rich domain that allowed him to think in longer timelines. Montgisard temporarily inverted this imbalance, but it did not erase it. Within the kingdom of Jerusalem, Baldwin's illness became impossible to ignore. His hands curled inward. His face bore deeper marks of leprosy. Pain alternated with numbness, making even simple tasks difficult. Yet he continued to appear publicly, understanding that visibility equaled authority. To vanish from view would invite internal rebellion as surely as external invasion. Succession, however, loomed like a shadow over every decision. Baldwin had no heirs. His sisters and their marriages became matters of state security. Factions maneuvered for influence, some prioritizing long-term survival, others personal power. Montgisard had united them briefly, but unity proved fragile once the immediate threat passed. Saladin observed these fractures carefully. He avoided major battles while encouraging pressure on multiple fronts. Raids probed defenses. Alliances were tested. Each year, the Crusader states were forced to spend resources reacting rather than recovering. Baldwin resisted as long as he could, but no single victory could reverse the demographic and strategic realities stacked against his kingdom. Montgisard nevertheless remained a benchmark against which all later battles were measured. Chroniclers on both sides returned to it repeatedly, analyzing its causes and consequences. Some emphasized divine intervention, others focused on tactical surprise and discipline. Modern historians tend to agree that it was the convergence of multiple factors rather than a miracle. Saladin's overconfidence, Baldwin's speed, the cohesion of Frankish heavy cavalry, and the psychological shock of an unexpected charge. Yet, reducing Montgisard to tactics alone misses its human core. Baldwin's presence mattered. Medieval warfare placed enormous importance on visible leadership. A king who fled was dishonored. A king who fought inspired loyalty beyond rational calculation. Baldwin's willingness to risk capture or death amplified the commitment of his knights. They were not fighting for abstract territory alone, but for a ruler who shared their danger. This bond between leader and soldier explains why the Frankish charge did not break under pressure. In many medieval battles, cavalry charges lost momentum as individuals pursued personal glory or loot. At Montgisard, discipline held because retreat was unthinkable. There was no plan B. Victory or annihilation were the only outcomes. Saladin's later success in capturing Jerusalem in 1187 has sometimes overshadowed Montgisard, leading to a simplified narrative of inevitable Muslim victory. This perspective distorts history. Montgisard delayed that outcome by a decade, forcing Saladin to adapt and refine his strategy. Without that delay, Jerusalem may have fallen much earlier, before Europe could respond or internal reforms could take place. Baldwin IV did not live to see Jerusalem fall. He died in 1185, still young, his body finally overcome by the disease he had resisted for so long. By then his authority had weakened, and the kingdom's internal divisions had deepened. His successors lacked his combination of courage, restraint, and strategic awareness. When Saladin returned in full force, the unity and timing that had defined Montgisard were absent. Even so, Baldwin's legacy endured. Among Christian chroniclers, he became a symbol of righteous kingship under trial. Among Muslim historians, he was respected as a formidable opponent whose courage was undeniable. Montgisard itself entered military history as a case study in asymmetrical victory, long before the term existed. The battle reminds us that history is not governed solely by numbers or resources. It is shaped by decisions made under pressure, by leaders who understand when caution becomes surrender, and by moments when morale tips the balance between collapse and triumph. Baldwin IV did not defeat Saladin permanently, but he shattered the illusion of invincibility, proving that even the strongest forces can be undone by complacency. As the dust of Montgisard settled, the Near East returned to its long struggle, but it did so changed. For a brief, brilliant moment, the course of events bent away from expectation. That bend, however temporary, remains one of the most dramatic reminders that history is written not only by the powerful, but by those willing to risk everything when the moment demands it. In the final reckoning, the Battle of Montgisard stands not as an isolated miracle, but as a turning point that revealed the limits of power and the price of leadership. By the time the dust of history settles, what remains is not simply the image of a smaller force defeating a larger one, but the deeper truth that Montgisard exposed the fragile balance upon which empires rise and fall. After Baldwin IV's death in 1185, the Kingdom of Jerusalem lost its most unifying figure. His successors inherited not only a crown, but an impossible position. Without Baldwin's authority and discipline, rival factions hardened. Personal ambition replaced collective survival. Decisions once guided by caution and clarity became clouded by intrigue. Montgisard had bought time, but time alone could not compensate for fractured leadership. Saladin, now fully prepared and fully patient, resumed his long campaign with lessons learned in blood. He avoided reckless dispersal. He tightened logistics. He chose battlefields carefully and ensured unity of command. By 1187, when he confronted the Crusader forces at Hattin, the conditions that had enabled Montgisard were gone. The Frankish army was divided, dehydrated, and poorly coordinated. The shock, discipline, and leadership that had once saved Jerusalem were absent. The fall of Jerusalem later that year was not a contradiction of Montgisard, but its grim confirmation. Montgisard proved that victory was possible against overwhelming odds. Hattin proved that such victories could not be repeated without the same rare alignment of leadership, morale, and circumstance. Together, the two battles frame the rise and fall of the Crusader East. Modern historians approach Montgisard with caution, separating legend from fact. Medieval sources often inflated numbers, dramatized speeches, and attributed outcomes to divine will. Yet, even stripped of exaggeration, the core reality remains unchanged. Baldwin IV led a severely outnumbered force into a sudden, disciplined assault that shattered a much larger army through surprise and psychological collapse. This alone secures Montgisard's place among history's most remarkable military upsets. The battle also challenges simplistic narratives about medieval warfare. It was not brute force that decided the outcome, but timing, cohesion, and leadership. Heavy cavalry did not triumph because it was unstoppable, but because it was used at the precise moment when the enemy was most vulnerable. Saladin's army was not defeated because it lacked courage or skill, but because confidence dissolved into confusion when shock replaced expectation. Baldwin IV's role remained central. His illness did not weaken his authority. On the contrary, it sharpened it. Medieval society placed enormous value on visible courage, and Baldwin's refusal to retreat into symbolic kingship inspired loyalty that could not be coerced. His presence on the battlefield transformed the charge from a tactical maneuver into a collective act of defiance. Men fought not merely for land or faith, but for a king who stood beside them in the most literal sense. This human element is why Montgisard continues to resonate. It reminds us that history is shaped by individuals acting under extreme pressure, making choices that defy probability. Baldwin could have withdrawn behind walls. He could have delayed, negotiated, or retreated. Instead, he chose confrontation at the moment when failure would have meant annihilation. That choice, more than any formation or weapon, defined the outcome. The legacy of Montgisard extends beyond the Crusades themselves. Military scholars study it as an early example of asymmetrical victory. Political historians examine it as a case where legitimacy and morale outweighed material strength. Storytellers return to it because it contains all the elements of enduring drama: a dying king, an overconfident conqueror, and a single day that altered expectations on both sides of a great conflict. Montgisard did not save the kingdom of Jerusalem forever. It did not halt Saladin's rise, but it disrupted inevitability, it forced adaptation, it delayed conquest. In doing so, it reshaped a decade of history and preserved a fragile kingdom long enough for its final chapters to be written on different terms. In the end, Montgisard teaches a sobering lesson. Extraordinary victories cannot compensate indefinitely for structural weakness. Courage can bend history, but it cannot suspend it. Yet without moments like Montgisard, history would be poorer, flatter, and less human. The battle stands as proof that even in an age dominated by kings and empires, individual resolve still mattered. On November 25, 1177, a dying teenage king and a few hundred knights rode into the path of an empire and broke it for a day. That day has never been forgotten.